It is once again October, and one thing I of course always enjoy doing this time of year is playing what I consider to be Halloween games. Now of course everyone has their own criteria for what constitutes a Halloween game. For some people it's just going to be anything scary. Resident Evil, Five Nights at Freddy's, Silent Hill, it's all good. But other people are a lot more fastidious with their criteria, focusing more on how the game looks and how the game feels, the game's atmosphere and tone. Now it goes without saying that neither of these mindsets are wrong, but I definitely fall into the latter camp. I define the spirit of Halloween to be more fun and lighthearted than scary or frightening, and the games I like to play this time of year definitely reflect this. These are some of my favorite Halloween games. The Ghosts and Goblins series is a go-to for many people when it comes to Halloween games, although personally I prefer its spin-off series, Gargoyle's Quest. Now in other videos I've already talked about the original Gargoyle's Quest on the Game Boy and its kinda sorta sequel on the NES. So today I'm going to briefly look at the third game of the series, Demon's Crest on the Super Nintendo. Not only is Demon's Crest a fantastic looking game, it also addresses my chief complaint with the previous two games by injecting the series with a much needed shot of Metroidvania. As with Gargoyle's Quest 1 and 2, Firebrand upgrades his abilities over the course of the game, but unlike the previous two games, many of these abilities are tied to the various alternate elemental forms he acquires. More importantly, these newly acquired abilities open up previously inaccessible areas in earlier stages, which in my opinion was a missed opportunity in the first two games. One more note about Demon's Crest, it apparently sold very poorly when it came out, probably due to the fact that it was called Demon's Crest instead of Gargoyle's Quest 3. However, there was a rumor a while back that there was a time period when it was returned to stores more often than it was sold, resulting in negative sales for a week. Or a month, or a year, I don't know, the details seem to change a lot. I'm not sure if this story is still being circulated, but I do not believe it for a second. That is not true. I would, however, totally believe that more people bought this game out of the bargain bin than at full price. That's probably a bit more accurate to what actually happened. Now, few games encapsulate the spirit of Halloween better than the Castlevania series. Castlevania is quite easily one of my favorite video game series of all time. In fact, game for game, I probably like it even more than the Mega Man series. And as someone who is, for lack of a better word, obsessed with Mega Man, that is quite a statement. Now, I'm sure I could spend all night talking about the various Castlevania games, but for the sake of brevity, right now I'm just going to be focusing on my favorite game in the series. The original OG Castlevania for the NES, released in the US in 1987. At the risk of sounding hyperbolic, I'll start by saying that Castlevania is a perfect game. Many of the later games in the series have surpassed it in various ways, but none have diminished the impact of the original game. Its graphics, while quaint by today's standards, still hold up very well, and it still has some of the best and most iconic music in the series. It also has a perfectly balanced difficulty level, which is to say it's an incredibly challenging game, and yet it's very fair and forgiving at the same time. For example, how many games can you think of let you continue indefinitely at the start of the hardest boss fight in the game? Now, so much has been said about this game over the years that I really don't feel that I have much to add. I will say that for as many times as I've played through it, I'm still amazed by the thoughtful stage design, how every elevated platform is justified by some logical background element, as opposed to the magical hovering structures of the Mario and Mega Man games. I also love how connected each of the stages feel to one another, how the game follows a natural path from beginning to end. You start with a quick jaunt through the castle entrance, leading to a climb through the interior of the castle itself, followed by a harrowing trek across the crumbling outer walls. One detail I love here is that you can briefly see Dracula's iconic clock tower in the background. But before you can reach it, the floor crumbles under your feet and you plummet into the flooded caverns below the castle. You ascend back into the castle proper through the dungeons and finally reach the broken bridge work seen earlier in the game, connecting to the clock tower where Dracula lies in wait. One more note, every time I play through the game, I'm always on the lookout for secret items. By crouching or standing on specific tiles, you can make glowing treasures appear. They don't really seem to serve any purpose other than increasing your score, but it's always exciting to find a new one, and I know I haven't found them all. It seems that with many long-running video game series, the sequels make so many changes and improvements to the core formula that it becomes increasingly difficult to go back and enjoy the original game in the series. But Castlevania is one of those rare instances where the first game was so good and so, dare I say, perfect right out of the gate that it still looks and plays just as good as it ever did, even compared to how far the series has come since then. Now, I know I said I was only going to talk about the original Castlevania, but I'm going to cheat a little bit and say a few words about one of its sequels. Super Castlevania 4. Despite being numbered 4th in the series, it's generally understood that this is more of a reimagining of the original NES game, although that's not obvious until you get to the game's final stages. Most of Super Castlevania actually takes place before you get to Dracula's castle, which is just one of the many changes Konami made with this game, not all of which were for the better. Most notably, they completely overhauled the play control. Simon can whip in all directions now, and for the first time he actually has some control over the trajectory of his jumps. Sub-weapons have also been mapped to the shoulder buttons, instead of requiring you to hold up an attack to use them, meaning that you can throw your axes and boomerangs while going up and down the stairs. These changes alleviate many of the frustrations that people had with the first 3 games, but they had the adverse effect of almost completely stripping away the challenge the series is known for. If the first 3 games in the series were NES hard, then Super Castlevania is SN easy. I have to say that as easy as the bulk of this game is, the difficulty spike in the game's final stage comes out of nowhere. This climb through the last tower is absolutely maddening, and I hate it. But don't worry, once you get through this mess, the game defaults back to easy mode again. Hey, thanks for the health recovery item, final boss. Also, why are you helping me? It should also be noted that this was a very early release for the Super Nintendo, and Super Castlevania seems to have taken upon itself the duty of showcasing the hardware advantages over the original NES. There are many extended sequences that seem to exist only to highlight the technical prowess of the Super Nintendo. Graphics. Graphics. Graphics! Once the novelty of seeing these effects for the first time wears off though, it becomes more obvious that this is simply style over substance. Even worse, some of these sequences throw off the game's pace and honestly make the game drag. It's because of these moments, combined with the fact that Super Castlevania is one of the most toothless entries to the series, that I often find myself just getting bored. Also, just about every other element in the game feels less than amazing. The graphics look very nice, but I really don't like the character designs, especially the skeletons, the most numerous enemy in the game. These don't look like Castlevania skeletons. These look kinda derpy. Simon himself is a great looking sprite, but he feels too big, which has a tendency to make it harder to avoid the various traps and enemies in the game. The soundtrack, which is a highlight for many people it seems, to me just sounds off. It's good music, don't get me wrong, but Castlevania is known for big, triumphant, memorable anthems like Vampire Killer. Or Bloody Tears. Or Beginning. not subdued, atmospheric mood music. Or jazz flutes. To be fair, I can understand why Super Castlevania is a favorite for so many people. It's definitely the most accessible game in the series, and I imagine that for many people it's the only game in the original series that they've been able to finish. But for me, this isn't quite Castlevania, and Konami clearly saw things the same way, as they removed almost all of this game's quote-unquote improvements in the subsequent sequels, up until Symphony of the Night, that is. Now, despite how harshly it sounds like I'm judging this game, I still really like Super Castlevania, and I find myself coming back to it year after year. I just don't enjoy it nearly as much as any of the original NES games. That's right, any of them. But I can't deny that this is still a great game to play around Halloween, or for that matter, any time of the year. Now, of course, all Resident Evil games are great to play around this time of year, but in my opinion, Resident Evil 4 is the most Halloween-y of the series. Running through this quaint little village during what is clearly a chilly autumn evening, you almost expect to see a jack-o'-lantern or two. The centerpiece of the game is a sprawling Gothic castle that Dracula himself would be proud to call home, full of creepy, chanting monks and all manner of monsters and traps straight out of a Castlevania game. Now, compared to the previous entries to the series, Resident Evil 4 definitely leans more into the action genre than horror. But there are still plenty of genuinely frightening moments here, like Salazar's hedge maze. Or the sewers under the castle. Or the deserted, trash-strewn laboratory in the game's final chapter. Now, getting back to the NES again, here's a weird one, Monster Party, which could very well have been called, What the Fuck? The Game. You start the game as a generic video game kid with a baseball bat as your only weapon. However, if you eat a Dr. Mario pill, you transform into what I can only describe as a flying, laser-shooting bird demon. Also, the game takes place in a literal nightmare. I mean, just look at this imagery. This is terrifying stuff. You know, as much as it can be in 8-bit. The object of the game is to defeat all the bosses in each level, so you can collect the key that opens up the level's exit. These bosses are where the game really goes off the rails. There's a singing plant straight out of Little Shop of Horrors. There's a minotaur that tells you to move it before attacking you with an army of tiny cows. There's a trio of tempura fried food items that emerge one after the other from the transporter pods from The Fly. There's a pair of zombies who just want you to watch them dance, and one creature who doesn't do anything because he's already dead. Now, outside of these elements, Monster Party isn't really anything to write home about. The graphics, music, and play control are only serviceable, and the core gameplay mechanics are honestly pretty repetitive. And it also has what is probably the worst door maze level that I've ever experienced. It's almost like halfway through the game's development, they realized how unremarkable their game was turning out to be. So they decided to compensate for it by making it as weird as possible. And they succeeded. Because they did that, Monster Party is one of the most amazing games I've ever played. Monster in My Pocket was a line of collectible minifigures produced by Matchbox in 1990. Even though by that time I was getting a bit too old for toys, I had a ton of these things as a kid. Although today, I sadly only have one. As you can see, they are very similar to muscle figures, which I also loved, but much more rubbery and flexible. What was great about this series is that its creature designs mined inspiration from just about every source imaginable, mixing commonplace monsters like werewolves and witches with more obscure creatures from mythology and folklore like the Spring Hill Jack and the Baba Yaga. Even the Loch Ness Monster and Bigfoot were represented here, so clearly the designers didn't draw the line at just fictional creatures. Along with the toy line, there was a short-lived comic book series, which I never read, and it also had an animated Halloween special, which I never saw. However, thanks to Nintendo Power, I was fully aware when the franchise made its way to the NES, in the form of an action platformer developed by Konami. Now, not having read the comics or watched the cartoon, I can neither confirm nor deny whether the game's story follows any kind of established lore. All I can say for sure is that I want that Konami TV. Warlock, the bad guy, has sent an army of toy-sized monsters to destroy the good guys, represented here by the vampire who is not Dracula, and Frankenstein's monster. The two heroes immediately jump to action, and the next 6 stages represent their journey to bring the fight to Warlock's doorstep. At the start of the game, you can choose to play as either the vampire or the monster. There's no difference in the way the two characters play, so this is purely a superficial choice, but it's a nice touch regardless. You can also grab a friend and play through the game with simultaneous multiplayer, which is a welcome addition to the gameplay. Controls couldn't be simpler. D-pad moves your character, A button jumps, yada yada. Pressing A while in the air will perform a double jump, which automatically makes any game better. Although the timing to pull this off consistently is a bit more finicky than what we'd see in, say, Symphony of the Night years later. Your main attack is this swiping strike, which has excellent range as far as melee attacks go. You'll also come across random objects like keys and bolts that you can pick up and fling around. You can even carry these all the way through the stages and use them against bosses, although they don't seem to do any more damage than your standard attack. The stage design does a good job at conveying that these are indeed pocket-sized monsters in a human-sized world. The first stage is the bedroom and staircase of a giant house. You'll also run through a giant kitchen, a giant sewer, a giant construction site, and a giant Oriental garden. Oh wait, can I say that? I mean a giant Asian garden. And finally, there's the very normal-sized Monster Mountain, which isn't so much a mountain as it is a hole in the ground. So why would they call it a, you know what, never mind. Along the way, you'll have to fight through hordes of Warlock's monster minions, most of which are recognizable from their real-life toy counterparts, although some creative liberties have been taken. The main enemies in Monster Mountain are Godzilla and King Ghidorah. Okay, sure, the manual calls them Tyrannosaurus Rex and Great Beast, but come on, who do they think they're fooling? Before you square off against Warlock at the end of Monster Mountain, you first have to refight all 5 bosses from the previous stages. In between each segment of this boss rush, you'll descend deeper and deeper into the mountain. This sequence is so drawn out that it's impossible not to see it for what it really is. Padding. Yeah, this is a very short game. From start to finish, it will probably take you about half an hour to complete. And complete it you will because Monster in My Pocket doesn't really put up much of a fight. Veterans of Castlevania and Contra may be surprised by the level of challenge in this game, or more accurately, the distinct lack of challenge. This game falls just below what I would consider to be a moderate degree of difficulty, which is a bit disappointing. It's not that I especially love hard games, but I do prefer to have to work a little to see the end of the game. Still, the game was fun enough to play, and the stages are varied and interesting enough that I never got bored. Also, the game is accompanied by a lively soundtrack, which is not as iconic and epic as the music in, say, Castlevania, but it's still catchy and memorable, and it often got me grooving a bit. Now, as you know, Konami was a top-tier developer for the NES, and they were responsible for many of the very best games on the console. But even slight missteps like Adventures of Bayou Billy, Castlevania 2, the original Ninja Turtles game, and maybe even Metal Gear, I don't know, paint the picture of a highly skilled developer who was not content with predictable paint-by-numbers games, nor were they afraid to take risks. You may hate some of these games, but you can't deny that, for better or worse, Konami's games were often on a different level entirely than many of the other titles that were simply shoveled into the NES library, even if they sometimes stumbled in their execution. Compared to many other Konami games, Monster in My Pocket is one of the most unremarkable games that they made for the system, and in fact, kind of feels like a game that they just kind of banged out for the paycheck. But other than being more than a touch on the easy side, there's not really much to criticize about the game at all. Conversely, it doesn't really do much to warrant a lot of praise either, which is probably the worst thing I could say about it. But as I pointed out many times before, there were a ton of genuinely bad games in the NES library, and Monster in My Pocket is a masterpiece compared to the games that many other developers were putting out. This game feels a bit pedestrian only within the context of being a Konami game. It doesn't compare favorably to upper echelon titles like Castlevania 3, Contra, or Life Force. It doesn't have the scope of Castlevania 2 or the diversity of Bayou Billy, but it's as short and sweet as a handful of Halloween candy. It may not be as fulfilling as many of their other titles, but it truly speaks to what an amazing developer Konami was, that even when they weren't giving their all, they could still put together a better game than just about anyone else. Alright, I have a few more games to show you, so I'm going to wrap this up with a montage of Halloween goodness. Starting with a game called Oni-Chanbara Bikini Zombie Slayers. And yeah, it's pretty much exactly what it sounds like. Thank you very much for watching, and let me know in the comments what your favorite Halloween games are. I'm Mr. Matthews. Happy Halloween.